New details today about convicted killer Alec Murdaugh.
And Murdaugh filed a response to a lawsuit regarding his former housekeeper's death. He's once again admitting to lying. Insurance company Nautilus suing the former Low Country lawyer, claiming he stole millions of dollars meant for his former housekeeper's family. Gloria Satterfield, who you see here, died at the Murdaugh home after a fall in 2018. Last month, Murdaugh filed for an extension, saying being in prison affected his ability to take part in the case. And now he's answering, saying he lied about some details the day of her fall, including that Murdaugh's dog caused it. He admits to making false statements to the insurance company and that he, quote, misused vulnerable persons who trusted him, admitting the money from the settlement went to an account that he owned rather than the Satterfield family. And one of the things Murdaugh is denying, the allegations he co-conspired with anyone else to get the money. You can see the entire response at foxcarolina.com.